Brandon Aiyuk does not have to walk into the 49ers building to keep pushing his way closer to Washington.
You are Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome inside today's episode of Locked On Commanders. I am your host, your guy on the ground, David Harrison. And on today's episode, Brandon Aiyuk finally telling his side of the story. But first, Brandon Aiyuk does not have to physically report to the San Francisco 49ers facility to keep this thing moving along. And the more he publicly explains his side of the story, the more this feels like it's a standoff that's truly headed toward Washington, like we've all pretty much been expecting really from the jump, I think. Brandon Aiyuk says he's never setting foot in the 49ers building again until he does so as a Washington Commanders receiver on October 19th from Monday Night Football in Week 6. And if you've been following along with this story, which I know a lot of you have, but I also know that a lot of you do not follow along with it, and you just wait for updates as they come. Brandon Aiyuk took to social media once again and decided to not just air out some of his grievances against the 49ers, but actually share a little bit of his side of the story. So we're going to get into that, but we're going to start off actually with a question from an All Access Everydayer Club member. Hamadou came through, sent me a text message regarding Brandon Aiyuk and asked me, can he really get released without setting foot in the building? There's a lot of talk about him speeding up his release by reporting. Since he doesn't seem to want to do that, can he still be released, or is reporting to the 49ers facility a must? And I think it was a really great question and something that we're going to talk about here at the top of this episode, because no, Brandon Aiyuk does not actually have to set foot in the facility. In fact, there's really no reason for him to even go to the facility, at least not to apply for the reinstatement. So the process for reinstatement, and I always kind of put this caveat on it because I'm not an agent, not a GM, certainly not an NFL player. As I understand it, the process for reinstatement for Brandon Aiyuk basically follows this timeline. He's got to send a formal application for reinstatement to Roger Goodell, the NFL commissioner. A copy of that application or that letter, that affidavit, whatever it's called, goes to the San Francisco 49ers. It is officially in writing type of thing. Once it's reviewed by the league, and this is not a next day process, this is a process that can actually take a little bit of time. The NFL then either grants him his reinstatement or it denies him his reinstatement. Assuming he's granted reinstatement, which I believe that he will, because I don't think he's done anything so crazy that he would not get reinstated, the 49ers would then have 5 days to decide to release him, trade him, or they would have to add him to their 90-man roster. But here's kind of the rub on that whole thing. That 5 days is triggered by his reporting. He doesn't have anything to report to right now because there is no team activity. There has to be an official team activity happening in order for Brandon Aiyuk to be able to report. So the next one is training camp. So until he reports, the 5-day clock doesn't start, right? So just simply reporting doesn't actually force anything by itself. Now, he's also said in other social media posts that the 49ers should just release him already. And according to my research and from my understanding, they can do that. They don't have to wait until he's reinstated to actually release him, because what we're talking about here is contractual rights and all that kind of stuff. So the 49ers can give up their right to him and give up their contract to him and all that kind of stuff anytime they want to, from my understanding. If he were to sign in Washington in this case, so let's say the 49ers released him before he was reinstated, so he's still on the reserve left team list, right? So he's still, not part of the NFL as far as, all legal terms are considered. He's released. His contract is released. The Washington Commanders then sign him to a new contract. He would still have to apply for reinstatement, but that, of course, would then just be a formality more than anything. The NFL, once they reviewed it, they approve it. The Washington Commanders would then have 5 days to add him to the 90-man roster. Could it take a day or two or three or four or even 5? Yeah, because they would have to then decide, who are we going to move? Maybe they try to trade somebody off the 90-man roster, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean, because I can see that becoming a storyline as he signs with Washington, applies for reinstatement, and then, it doesn't happen right away. He gets approved for reinstatement, I should say, and then doesn't happen right away that he's added to the roster, and people start getting a little bit nervous about, did he ghost the Commanders too? No, it could take Adam Peters 5 days to do it, because he's got to make a corresponding roster move, deciding what that roster move is, yada, 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 et cetera, et cetera. So if Aiyuk applies for reinstatement right now, basically the biggest impact it has from where I sit, and again, this is just from my angle, is it basically signals to the 49ers that he's playing chicken with them, that they're now both on the same road going towards training camp, and that he is going to report, that he is now basically telling them, listen, I'm going to be a part of this circus even more unless you decide to call it, because ultimately the 49ers are the ones, and they've made sure to flex that power over him, that they're the ones in control. However, if Aiyuk applies and is granted reinstatement, the 49ers could, or possibly even would, likely try to pull the same thing that they did before, which is what Richard Sherman recently talked about on his podcast, where they tell Brandon Aiyuk that not only does he need to report for training camp, he's got to report 4 days early, because before, and that's before any other players have to report, before even the rookies have to report, because they want to do a full battery of medical tests since he is coming off that injury, which is protocol according to Richard Sherman, and which is one of the steps that led to this whole thing in the first place. Now, to avoid this, to anticipate your opponent's move like this is a chess match, Brandon Aiyuk could wait until around July 11th to apply for reinstatement, which puts the 2-week window it typically takes for reinstatements to be reviewed by the league right at the date the 49ers open camp, 3 days before the Washington Commanders open camp. So if that decision comes down, say July 11th, or he waits until July 11th and the decision comes down right before camp, well, then the 49ers obviously can't ask you to show up 4 days early if you haven't been reinstated 4 days early, and he'd essentially be reporting when all the players and the coaches, and this is the most important part, the media are all present, because I think that's ultimately what the San Francisco 49ers really want to avoid, is Brandon Aiyuk being interviewed by San Francisco 49ers media, especially guys like Grant Cohn, who are not afraid to ask the upfront questions out there in San Francisco, which I'll tell you right now, John Lynch is already needing to prepare for Grant Cohn to ask him why he just showed up unannounced at Brandon Aiyuk's house. Although if Brandon Aiyuk is no longer part of the team, John Lynch then gets to say, hey, I understand the question, but we're not going to talk about players who are no longer part of the team. And he gets to kind of avoid the topic altogether. If Brandon Aiyuk is still part of the team by, affiliation at least, then it's a little bit harder for John Lynch to skirt the question. So just throwing that little extra bit of seasoning out there on there. Of course, even if the league and the 49ers reinstate him early before training camp to allow for the 4-day early report, Aiyuk could simply just tell him, I'm not showing up 4 days early. I'm going to show up on the day of training camp. I'll take the fines and put San Francisco in a situation where they then have to deal with him being around for the media and the PR circus to follow. Ultimately, the result is going to be the same, right? Brandon Aiyuk is going to be released at a date to be determined. All arrows point to him becoming a Commander at that time. And while I have been simply just accepting of that reality for a long time, I don't know why others have been kind of trying to fight that. I now kind of see where Brandon Aiyuk is coming from a little bit, now that we finally have a little bit of his side of the story. That and more coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Commanders brought to you by Indeed. Sponsored jobs, workplace chaos can show up fast, and that is where Indeed sponsored jobs comes in, because they know that finding the right person can make all the difference, because getting that great addition to your team can have a ripple effect around everyone around them. And the best organizations aren't trying to look at every possible option. They're focused on identifying the people or the person who truly match what it is they're looking for. And when you can spend more time evaluating great candidates and less time searching, everybody benefits. That's exactly what Indeed sponsored jobs is designed to help businesses do. And when you need the right person on the job, turn to Indeed sponsored jobs. And as a listener of this show, you get a $75 sponsored job credit so that your posting gets the premium status it deserves. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast to cash that in. That site again, Indeed.com/podcast. And make sure you let them know you heard about it right here on Locked On Commanders. Terms and conditions apply. But if you need to hire, this is a job for Indeed sponsored jobs. Brandon Aiyuk has been sharing his feelings about what's going on, but finally he shared some of his side of the story as well. Thank you for coming through for today's episode of Locked On Commanders. Thank you for making Locked On Commanders your first listen or your first view today and every day. And to the everydayers who come through for every single episode, I appreciate you coming through yet again for today's episode. If you want to get content, get access that goes beyond our normal everyday episodes, you can do so by becoming an Everydayer Club member. And to do that, just go to lockedoncommanders.supercast.com. Get your first week for free. Again, lockedoncommanders.supercast.com to become an Everydayer Club member today. Brandon Aiyuk dropped a roughly 3-minute video on his YouTube channel recently. And in it, he talked about 5 things One of those things we already talked about, his assertion that he will not step foot in a 49ers facility until October 19th. But he also talked about 4 other things here, including a comment on Kyle Shanahan's temperament. But first, saying, quote, "I don't care how long I got to wait," end quote, to get to the Washington Commanders. Brandon Aiyuk basically just bound and determined to become a Washington Commander. He's done more than enough to show everybody that the assumption we've all been making is accurate, that he wants to be a Washington Commander, but just flat out saying, "I don't care how long I got to wait to become a Washington Commander." So again, if you're a Commanders fan and you want Brandon Aiyuk on your team, it's a matter of when, not if. And if you don't want Brandon Aiyuk on your team, I would just say it's coming. So hope for the best type of situation, I suppose. Kyle Shanahan, Brandon Aiyuk said, quote, "has the temperament of a effing toddler," end quote. He did not say effing. He said the real word. I said effing because this is a family show. Not the first time we've heard Kyle Shanahan, whether it's called petty, whether it's called whatever. So not the first time here. But here's where things get really interesting, where, again, this whole time I haven't really taken a side, right? Now, much of the discourse around this Brandon Aiyuk situation has been about piling onto Brandon Aiyuk and saying he's all at fault. It's only on the player. And if you've ever lived even a decent amount of real life, you know that when these types of things happen, very rarely is it on one person. I'm not saying Brandon Aiyuk is free of responsibility at all, but very rarely are these situations on one party in the mix up here. But Brandon Aiyuk's sharing at least a little bit of what came on from the other side. So he said he fired his agent, and that's been a little bit in question because his agent is still registered as his agent in NFL, or his former agent is still registered as his current agent in the NFLPA database. But the NFLPA database doesn't necessarily just like the agent can be fired, and Brandon Aiyuk has not filed the paperwork to remove him as his agent in the NFLPA system. Those two things can coexist. So the fact that he's still registered as his agent in the NFLPA system doesn't really mean anything, to be honest with you. So not really sure why people were harping on that. But anyway, fired his agent, and he says in the video that his agent is also, or his former agent was also John Lynch's agent, which that whole situation to me is just kind of weird, because that means that when Brandon Aiyuk was holding out for this new contract that he got in 2024, that his agent, who was playing hardball for him, supposedly, with his other client. Like, it just seems like a situation where the agent would have to recuse himself, and, either a third party would have to come. I don't know. But it just seems weird to have a player represented by an agent negotiating with a GM represented by the same agent for the same contract, and they're playing hardball, and it's a tense situation. And this guy is supposed to be what? Like, he's supposed to be, I don't know. It just seems like a weird situation to me. I know, like, above all, like, at the end of the day, professionalism is professionalism, but these are human beings, and we know that human beings are fickle people. And the 49ers have obviously proven they're also very petty people. So John Lynch being a part of that, I don't know. It's just weird to me. But the biggest weird thing that came out of that story is Brandon Aiyuk sharing that his former agent, who is still currently, as far as I know, John Lynch's agent, after he was fired from Brandon Aiyuk, the agent, texts Brandon Aiyuk's wife. Didn't say what he texted her, but he said thought he was smart or something like that. And text my wife is what Brandon Aiyuk said. I will tell you right now, that is not okay. Like, that is just not okay. I don't care. That is not okay. You are a player's agent, unless you are the wife's agent as well, which it doesn't seem that is the case. You have zero business texting that man's wife after he fires you. So that right there alone. And again, that's not directly on the 49ers, because the 49ers don't control that agent's behavior. But again, he's connected to John Lynch. It's just a really weird situation, really bad and uncomfortable, right? But then it gets to actual 49ers action, where John Lynch, according to Brandon Aiyuk, quote unquote, pulled up to my house, quote unquote, uninvited, just pulled up to the house. And I will tell you right now, if you're my boss and we're having beef, if Ross Jackson doesn't like the way I'm conducting myself on Locked On Commanders, and he's out here in the streets telling people about it and all this other stuff, and then you just pull up to my house, you're not going to get a warm welcome from me. And apparently, Brandon, from the sounds of the story, Brandon wasn't even at home, or maybe he was. I can't remember the entire story off the top of my head. But either way, you don't pull up. Like, just bottom line, do not pull up to my house if we're having problems. That's not going to go well for you. So again, does it necessarily justify everything that's happened, you know what I mean, right off the cuff. No, but I can definitely tell you, if you talk about a player feeling disrespected, feeling that borders have been crossed, feeling that privacy lines have been crossed, and all this other kind of stuff, absolutely can see a little bit of where the environment was not necessarily what Brandon Aiyuk would want to be a part of. So interesting stuff coming out of Brandon Aiyuk's camp. Also has me on a little bit of a different category, which is just how healthy the 49ers organization really is. Don't want to go too deep on that because I'm not here to just bash the San Francisco 49ers, but I've done a little bit of research. It's a little bit interesting. So next time on Locked On Commanders, we may dive into that just a little bit. Of course, we are going to talk more watching Commanders stuff. I got more OTA notes, more mandatory minicamp notes, and of course, we got to build up all the way to training camp as we enter the late or the early part of the summer, nearing training camp. Just about a month away now from Washington Commanders training camp. I appreciate you coming back for that episode, coming through for this episode, and coming through for any other episodes. And in between them, if you need me, you can find me on X at dharrison82, on Instagram at dharrison_82, or you can find me on your cell phone by texting me. And to do that, become an all-access member of the Everydayer Club, lockedoncommanders.supercast.com, to do that and get the first week for free to the Everydayers, as I do every day. I appreciate you coming through for today's episode and for all of our episodes. And to everybody out there, thanks for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. And until we meet again, be safe, be kind. We'll talk again real soon right here on Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.